In a world where your mate is your destiny, Elspeth's was a curse. She was the Omega ghost of the Stone Creek Pack, a girl deemed unworthy by the one man the goddess chose for her. Rejected by the Pack Alpha's son in a display of cruel ambition, she was broken, left to survive on scraps of dignity in a home that no longer felt like her own. She believed her story was over, a cautionary tale whispered by the fire. But destiny is a patient hunter. An ancient king is coming, a shifter of immense power who has ruled for centuries without a queen. He seeks fealty from his subjects, but fate has a grander design. For what a boy discards in his arrogance, a king will treasure above his crown. Chapter 1. The Scent of Hope. The air was thick with the scent of roasting boar and pine smoke, a celebratory perfume that felt like poison in Elspeth's lungs. She moved through the throng of her packmates, a ghost in gray spun wool, her presence as unnoticed as a stone in the dirt. Her fingers, chapped and red from her work, tightened around the handle of a heavy ale pitcher. She refilled the mugs of two boisterous warriors, their laughter booming over her head as if she wasn't there at all. They never saw her. No one ever did. This was the mating revel, a night of joyous destiny for everyone but her. Under the full silver eye of the moon, the goddess was said to bless her children, revealing the golden thread that tied two souls together. For years, Elspeth had watched from the shadows as friends found their other halves, their eyes glowing with a recognition she could only dream of. Tonight, that dream felt more like a nightmare. Her 18th birthday had passed, marking her as eligible, yet she knew her place. Omegas with disgraced bloodlines were not blessed. They were overlooked. Her gaze inadvertently drifted toward the center of the clearing. There he was, Lachlan, son of their Alpha, future leader of Stone Creek, and the unspoken prize of the revel. He was laughing, his strong shoulders thrown back, his dark hair catching the firelight. A circle of high-born she-wolves surrounded him, their own hopes practically shimmering in the air. Elspeth's stomach twisted. He was the sun, and she was the dirt beneath his boots. Looking at him for too long felt like staring into an eclipse, blinding and foolish. She quickly lowered her head, focusing on the mud-caked hem of her tunic. She retreated to the edge of the celebration, her back finding the familiar rough bark of an old oak. From here, she could observe without being observed. A part of her, the small, stupid part that hadn't yet been crushed by reality, still felt it, a tiny, flickering ember of hope. The legend said the goddess was blind to status, that she saw only the heart. It was a dangerous thought, one she should have extinguished long ago. Yet, as Alpha Stone moved to the center of the clearing to begin the rites, the ember pulsed with a faint warmth. "Let the revel begin," the Alpha's voice boomed, silencing the last of the whispers. "May the moon goddess guide you to your fate." As he spoke, a strange energy washed over the clearing, a palpable magic that made the hairs on Elspeth's arms stand on end. She squeezed her eyes shut, ready to endure the night. But then she felt it. A sudden, sharp pull in her chest, a violent tug toward the bonfire. It was a golden thread, invisible but real, and it was pulling her toward a destiny she was terrified to face. Her eyes snapped open, wide with shock and fear. Chapter 2. The Golden Thread. The world snapped back into focus with the force of a physical blow, the pull in Elspeth's chest an undeniable, absolute command. Her feet, clumsy and uncooperative, stumbled forward as her body moved without her permission. The dense crowd of her pack, a living wall just moments before, parted for her as if she were a hot iron. A wave of shocked and bewildered murmurs followed in her wake, the questions crackling in the air like static electricity. She was a ghost being dragged into the light, reeled by an unseen force toward the great bonfire, the very heart of their world. Her own heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of pure terror and dizzying disbelief. This had to be a mistake. A cruel, elaborate joke played by the fates, and she was the punchline. The invisible tether that bound her pulled taut and then dissolved, leaving her standing less than an arm's length from Lachlan. His easy laughter had died in his throat, his classically handsome face frozen in a mask of stunning disbelief. But it was his eyes that held her captive. That told the truth. They were glowing with a faint, unmistakable silver light, the sacred glow of the mating bond, the same earth-shattering magic she could feel thrumming like a second pulse beneath her own skin. For one infinite, suspended second, the rest of the universe ceased to exist. The roar of the fire, the collective gasp of the pack, the cool night air, it all faded into a muted, distant hum. There was only the overwhelming, soul-deep feeling of a lock clicking perfectly into place, of a piece of her spirit she never knew was missing suddenly, miraculously, returning home. A fragile, terrifying hope bloomed in the barren wasteland of her heart. The goddess did not see status, the old legend whispered in her mind. She saw only the soul. Lachlan's gaze held hers, and for a fleeting, beautiful instant, she saw the raw shock of the connection mirrored there, the undeniable pull that was her own. This was real. He felt it too. A dizzying cascade of images flooded her mind, a future where she wasn't ridiculed, a home where she was cherished, a mate who would be her shield. He would lift her from the dirt and call her his. The hope inside her unfurled, brilliant and consuming. But then, his expression shifted. The shock curdled, replaced by something cold and calculating as his gaze flickered over her worn gray tunic. The silver light in his eyes was swiftly overshadowed by the dark shadow of his ambition. She watched, horrified, as he weighed their divine connection against his earthly status, and she saw his pride win the war in his eyes. The impossible warmth of the bond turned instantly to ice. His jaw tightened, and his lips curled into a sneer of utter contempt as he drew in a deep, deliberate breath to speak. Chapter 3. Words like shards of glass. The clearing fell into a dead, ringing silence, so profound that the crackle of the bonfire sounded like roaring thunder. Every wolf, from the highest-born warrior to the lowest servant, was a statue, their eyes fixed on the Alpha's sun. They held their breath, waiting for his proclamation. Elspeth stood frozen before him, the beautiful, vibrant hope in her chest shriveling into a knot of pure dread under his glacial glare. The world had become a stage, and she was the unwilling sacrifice. You? Lachlan's voice was deceptively quiet, yet it cut through the silence like a shard of obsidian. The single word was laced with such profound disgust it made her flinch as if struck. He let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound utterly devoid of humor that echoed unnaturally in the stillness. The moon goddess must be mistaken. Then his posture changed. He straightened to his full, imposing height, puffing out his chest and projecting his voice so that it carried to the furthest edges of the clearing. This was no longer a private horror, but a public execution, a lesson for all to witness. I, Lachlan of the Silver Moon bloodline, reject you, Elspeth, he declared, each word a hammer blow against the fragile shield of her soul. He took a step closer, his shadow engulfing her. You are weak. You are nothing. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper meant only for her. But in the crushing silence, the entire pack heard it as clearly as a scream. You are unworthy to stand by my side. The moment the final word left his lips, a cataclysm of pain ripped through Elspeth's entire being. It was the sound of a soul tearing in two. The beautiful golden thread that had connected them moments before didn't just fade or fray. It snapped violently, searing her from the inside out with an agony so absolute it stole the air from her lungs. A raw, animalistic sob was torn from her throat as a gaping Arctic void opened where the impossible warmth of the bond had been. Her knees gave out, her body no longer able to support the weight of such devastation. She crumpled to the dirt, her hands clutching her chest as if she could physically hold the shattered pieces of herself together. The stunned silence of the pack finally broke, not with gasps of sympathy, but with the sharp, cruel sound of laughter. It began with a high-born she-wolf, a triumphant giggle that was quickly joined by others, a chorus of mockery that pierced through the thick fog of Elspeth's agony. They were laughing at her pain, celebrating her public humiliation. The sound mixed with the roaring in her ears and the searing emptiness in her spirit. The world tilted violently, the firelight splintering into 1,000 pieces. The last thing she knew was the hard-packed earth beneath her cheek, and the sound of their laughter as darkness mercifully swallowed her whole. Chapter 4. The Coldness of the Pack. Elspeth awoke to the feeling of cold dampness seeping through her thin tunic, the unforgiving earth leaching what little warmth she had left. The world returned not in a rush, but in a slow, agonizing crawl. The sharp, acrid scent of dying embers had replaced the comforting smell of pine, and the cruel laughter had faded into a cloud of hushed, pointed whispers that felt just as sharp. With a groan, she pushed herself up on trembling arms, her muscles aching with a deep, profound exhaustion, as if she'd been the one fighting, not the one who was broken. The main celebration was over, but a morbid gallery of onlookers remained, their faces illuminated in the flickering, dying light of the bonfire. They stared with an unnerving curiosity, as if she were a strange, wounded beast caught in a trap. No one moved to help her. No one offered a hand. No one spoke a word. Her desperate gaze scanned the crowd, frantically searching for a single shred of compassion, a lifeline in a sea of contempt. She found none. The faces of her packmates were a tapestry of cold expressions, the undisguised triumph on the faces of the she-wolves who had vied for Lachlan's attention, the fearful pity in the eyes of the other Omegas, who now saw her as a terrifying omen, and the cold indifference of the warriors. Her eyes finally landed on Alpha Stone. He stood beside his son, his expression not of disappointment in Lachlan's staggering cruelty, but of stern annoyance at the messy scene she had caused. Elspeth met his gaze, a silent, desperate plea from a member of his pack to her Alpha, the one sworn to protect them all. He held her gaze for a half-second, his eyes as hard and unforgiving as flint, before he turned his back on her completely. It was a silent verdict, a profound betrayal of his sacred duty. She was condemned, and her own Alpha had sealed her fate. A wave of nausea and shame so profound it almost sent her back to the ground washed over her. She had to leave. She had to escape their eyes. Forcing her shaking legs to obey, she pushed herself to her feet, swaying for a moment. The whispers followed her as she began the long, lonely walk away from the clearing, a walk of shame she knew would be seared into her memory forever. Every step was a monumental effort, her body screaming in protest, the void in her chest a physical weight dragging her down. Behind her, she could hear the pack slowly beginning to stir again, life resuming, leaving her tragedy behind as a mere footnote. She finally reached the small, dilapidated hut on the far edge of the pack grounds that she called home. The door whined on its leather hinges as she stumbled inside, leaning her back against the rough wood as she pushed it closed, plunging her world into darkness. The distant sounds of her pack were gone, replaced by a silence so absolute it was deafening. She slid down to the floor, wrapping her arms around her own waist, but there was no warmth to be found. She was utterly and completely alone in the crushing dark. Chapter 5. A Life in the Shadows. The 3 weeks that followed were a masterclass in systematic cruelty. The title of Rejected was a brand seared invisibly into Elspeth's skin, a scent of failure that every wolf in the pack could somehow smell. Her life, already a landscape of quiet hardship, descended into a new, more sinister kind of hell. Her Omega duties were changed from menial to foul. No longer was she mending tunics or serving ale. She was now tasked with cleaning the blood pits after a hunt, the coppery, metallic stench clinging to her hair and clothes for days. She was sent to tend the wolves afflicted with the rot, a contagious and foul sickness that caused fur to fall out in clumps, a task no one else would dare. A subtle message that her life was considered disposable. Her already meager food rations were often halved. On the days she received a full portion, she would find dirt or, more than once, spit, mixed into her watery stew. She learned to eat it anyway, the gnawing ache of hunger a more immediate torment than the profound humiliation. The physical abuse became bolder. Pups who had once been her playmates now saw her as a target for their games, sticking their legs out to trip her as she carried heavy buckets of waste. She would fall hard, scraping her knees on the rocky ground, the contents splashing over her. She learned to get up without a sound, choking back the hot tears, because she knew their mothers were watching from the doorways of their huts, their faces blank, doing nothing to stop them. The whispers were a constant venomous cloud that followed her everywhere. Unworthy, cursed. The wolf Lachlan cast aside. She built walls inside her mind to survive, trying to make the words nothing more than noise. She focused on her tasks, moving on autopilot, her emotions locked down into a state of perpetual numbness. The ember of hope that had flickered on the revel night was now a pile of cold, dead ash. One evening, as she scrubbed the great hall floor long after the evening meal, her hands raw and bleeding from the harsh lye soap, she heard it. Laughter. Rich, confident, and utterly carefree, it drifted from the terrace. It was Lachlan, holding court with a group of adoring she-wolves. He was telling a story of a hunt, his voice booming with pride. The sound was a physical blow, a knife twisting in the old, unhealed wound in her soul. For him, that night was a distant memory. For her, it was a wound that refused to stop bleeding. Looking down, she saw her reflection in the grimy water at her feet, a hollow-eyed, gaunt stranger. A single, cold thought, clear as a winter sky, cut through her numbness. There is no future for me here. Chapter 6. Whispers of the King. The thought had become a dangerous comfort, a cold, sharp stone she could press against the ache in her chest. There is no future for me here. Elspeth repeated it to herself as she hauled a bucket of rancid water from the kennels, the stench so foul it made her eyes water. The thought wasn't a plan, not yet. It was simply a fact, a truth she had come to accept in the darkest hours of the night. Her life in Stone Creek was a slow death, and some part of her was beginning to wonder if a quicker end beyond the pack borders would be a mercy. A sudden, sharp blast from a horn at the valley's edge cut through the mundane misery of the afternoon. It was a sound of urgency, of news arriving. Instantly, the pack grounds stirred. Wolves in their human form emerged from huts and training circles, their heads turned toward the main gate. Another horn blast, closer this time, and then the sound of galloping hoofbeats. Elspeth moved to the side, making herself small as a lone rider on a lathered, dust-caked horse thundered past her, bearing the royal crest of the Alpha King on his tunic. He dismounted before the Alpha's lodge in a spray of dirt, handing a sealed scroll to Alpha Stone's waiting beta. Within the hour, the entire pack was summoned to the clearing. It was the first time they had all been gathered since the night of the revel. Elspeth was forced to attend, relegated to the very back, a pariah standing in the long shadows of the ancient oaks. Alpha Stone stood before them, the scroll in his hand, his face an unreadable mask of grim importance. He broke the seal, his eyes scanning the elegant script before he addressed his pack. "A proclamation from the court of Alpha King Elijah," he announced, his voice booming with forced solemnity. "In 1 week's time, the king will honor Stone Creek with a royal visit for the decennial tithe of fealty." A massive, collective gasp went through the crowd. The Alpha King. Here. King Elijah was a figure of terrifying legend, an ancient wolf said to be centuries old, his power absolute. His visits were incredibly rare and always a test. It was an honor, but it was the kind of honor that could get an entire pack culled if they were found wanting. The frantic, excited whispers that erupted were laced with a thick thread of fear. The pack's focus, their collective contempt and scorn, shifted entirely away from Elspeth. For the first time in weeks, no one was looking at her. She was simply a forgotten stone in the shadow of a coming mountain. She felt a small, hollow sense of relief. The king was nothing to her. His world was so far removed from her own that he might as well have been a star in the sky. He could not possibly make her life any worse. But as her alpha began barking orders, his eyes sweeping the crowd, a new, cold dread began to settle in her stomach. "This pack will be perfect," he roared. "Every warrior, every den, every Omega. Any imperfection will be seen as a direct insult to the king. We will not be found wanting." Elspeth froze, the blood draining from her face. She was the pack's most visible imperfection. Chapter 7. The Alpha's Ambition. Inside the relative quiet of the Alpha's lodge, the air was thick with tension. The scent of wood smoke and curing leather did little to mask the acrid smell of anxiety. Alpha Stone paced before the hearth, his heavy footsteps a counterpoint to the crackling flames. Lachlan stood rigidly by the table, his arms crossed, watching his father. He had never seen him this agitated, not even during the harshest of winters or border skirmishes with rival packs. The king's visit was something else entirely. A political battlefield where one wrong move could mean ruin. "This is an opportunity, Lachlan," Stone said, finally stopping his pacing to fix his son with an intense stare. "The king has no heir. For 50 years, the northern packs have curried his favor, trying to have their daughters presented. He has shown no interest. But he is old. He must be looking for a successor to his legacy, a territory to favor. If we show him unparalleled strength, perfect discipline, absolute loyalty." He let the words hang in the air. The unspoken promise was clear. A path to greater power than any of them had ever dreamed of. Lachlan nodded, his mind already racing. "Our warriors are the strongest in the region. Our tribute of pelts and iron will be generous. I will lead the demonstration of arms myself." "Good," Stone grunted. "But strength is only half of it. He will be looking for honor, for a pristine bloodline." His eyes narrowed, and the atmosphere in the room grew cold. "Which is why your public spectacle at the revel was the act of a foolish boy." Lachlan bristled, his own pride stung. "I did what was necessary. That thing. She was a disgrace. Her bloodline is tainted by her parents' weakness. Accepting her would have been a stain on our family, on the entire pack. I asserted my strength. I showed that I would not be shackled by a mistake of the goddess." "You asserted your arrogance," his father shot back, slamming a fist on the mantelpiece. "You created a loose thread, a messy emotional situation in public. Power is not about loud declarations, Lachlan. It is about quiet, unshakable control. Now, because of your performance, we have a visible blight in our pack, a rejected mate. It stinks of disorder." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "When the king arrives, she is to be nowhere to be seen. She will not serve. She will not be in the kitchens. She will not be scrubbing the damn floors. She is to be hidden away as if she never existed. Her presence is a stain on our honor." Lachlan's anger faded, replaced by cold understanding. His father wasn't concerned with the morality of his actions, only the political fallout. In that, they were in perfect agreement. The girl was an inconvenience, a problem to be managed. His ambition, the same ambition that had led him to cast her aside without a second thought, now demanded he erase her completely. "I understand, Father," he said, his voice hard. "Consider the stain removed." Chapter 8. Sanctuary in the Woods. The pack grounds had become an unbearable hive of frantic energy. Every wolf was on edge, scrubbing, polishing, and training with a feverish intensity. The air, once filled with casual cruelty toward Elspeth, was now thick with collective anxiety, which was somehow worse. She was given the foulest tasks, the ones meant to be done in the dark, far from where any important eyes might see her. She was ordered to clear out a generation of filth from beneath the warriors' barracks, a backbreaking and disgusting task. Halfway through the second day, covered in grime and feeling the walls of the pack closing in on her, she saw her chance. While the beta was distracted, berating another Omega, Elspeth slipped away, melting into the woods that bordered their territory. Here, the air was different. The frantic energy of the pack faded, replaced by a deep, calming silence, broken only by the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a crow. This was her only true home, her sanctuary. In the woods, she was not the rejected. She was just a creature, as much a part of the world as the moss on the trees and the stream that trickled over the rocks. She walked for nearly an hour, letting the peace of the ancient forest wash over her, cleansing the filth from her spirit, if not from her clothes. It was the sound of panicked bleating that drew her from her path. Near a thicket of blackberry bushes, a young fawn, barely old enough to have lost its spots, was caught in a cruel wire snare, likely set by a human poacher from the nearby villages. Its leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and the more it struggled, the tighter the wire bit into its flesh. Panic and pain radiated from the small creature. Forgetting her own misery, Elspeth's heart went out to it. She approached slowly, making soft crooning noises, her movements gentle and non-threatening. "Shh, little one," she whispered, her voice rusty from disuse. "I am here to help. Be still." It took several long minutes for the fawn to calm, its terrified eyes never leaving her. Elspeth's hands, though calloused, were surprisingly deft. She worked at the wire, her fingers carefully manipulating the twisted loop. The fawn flinched but held still, as if it understood her intent. Finally, the wire sprang loose. The fawn's leg was bleeding, the flesh raw and angry. Without hesitation, Elspeth gathered a handful of yarrow leaves, a plant she knew staunched bleeding, and chewed them into a rough poultice, just as her mother had taught her long ago. She gently applied the mash to the wound. The fawn trembled but allowed the treatment. When she was done, she backed away. The fawn, favoring its injured leg, gave her one last wide-eyed look before limping away into the safety of the trees. A profound, quiet satisfaction settled in Elspeth's chest. For the first time in weeks, she felt useful. She felt worthy. As the last rustle of the fawn's departure faded, a new feeling washed over her. The undeniable prickling sensation of being watched. It was not the familiar feeling of a pack member's scornful gaze. This was something different. Older, heavier, immense. Her heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm as she turned, scanning the deep, silent shadows of the ancient trees. Chapter 9. The Shadow Wolf. From the deepest shadows where the sunlight dared not touch, two eyes materialized. They were not the fierce, challenging silver of a pack wolf, nor the simple amber of a common wolf. These eyes glowed with a soft, internal luminescence, the color of ancient silver in moonlight. A heartbeat later, the creature attached to them stepped silently into a sun-dappled clearing. Elspeth's breath hitched in her throat. It was a wolf, but it was unlike any she had ever seen. It was massive, its shoulders standing as high as her own chest, its powerful muscles visible even beneath a thick coat of fur the color of a starless midnight sky. It was a creature of myth, a living shadow. A jolt of primal fear, ancient and instinctual, shot through her. Her body screamed at her to run, to climb a tree, to do anything but stand frozen before this apex predator. Yet her feet remained rooted to the spot. The fear was immediately tempered, then overridden, by a strange, inexplicable calm that radiated from the great wolf. It made no move to attack. There was no aggression in its stance, no hunger in its eyes. There was only a profound, intelligent stillness that was more unnerving than any snarl. The wolf watched her. It was not the mindless stare of an animal assessing prey. This felt like a scrutiny, a deep and penetrating gaze that seemed to look past her tattered clothes and the grime on her skin, peering directly into the battered core of her soul. The wolf's massive head tilted slightly, its luminous gaze drifting to her hands, still stained with the green juice of the yarrow leaves she had used on the fawn. Then, its eyes returned to her face, and she felt a flicker of something she could only interpret as approval. She found she couldn't look away. Holding the gaze of this magnificent creature felt less like a confrontation and more like a silent conversation. A powerful understanding seemed to pass between them in the quiet forest air. He saw her. He saw her act of kindness. He was not a threat to her. The intensity of the unspoken connection was overwhelming, a tangible pressure that made the very air feel thick and heavy, hard to draw into her lungs. After a long, silent moment that stretched into an eternity, the great wolf gave a barely perceptible nod. It was a gesture so intelligent, so deliberate and human-like, that it sent a shiver of awe and confusion down her spine. Then, as silently and mysteriously as it had appeared, it turned. With a single, fluid motion, it melted back into the deep shadows of the forest, vanishing without a sound, leaving not even a broken twig in its wake. Elspeth was left alone in the clearing, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer, raw power of the encounter. What was that? Chapter 10. The King's Arrival. The day the king arrived, the sky was a sheet of cold, gray steel. A horn sounded from the distance, a deep, resonant call that vibrated in Elspeth's bones. She was on her hands and knees, scrubbing the back steps of the Alpha's lodge with a stiff-bristled brush, a task meant to keep her both busy and invisible. From her position, tucked away behind the main structure, she could just peek through the thick wooden railings of the veranda to see the main path leading to the clearing. She heard them before she saw them. The rhythmic tread of heavy paws and marching feet, a sound of disciplined power. First came the royal guard, 24 of them, clad in dark, hardened leather armor that bore no crest but was instantly recognizable. They moved with a lethal grace, their faces grim and unreadable. Flanking them were war wolves, enormous shifters nearly the size of ponies, their coats bristling, their eyes scanning the territory with unconcealed threat. And then, at the center of the procession, he came. King Elijah did not ride. He walked, and the earth itself seemed to fall silent beneath his feet. He moved with a predator's fluid grace, an aura of absolute authority clinging to him like a cloak. Even from this distance, Elspeth could feel it, a palpable pressure, a weight in the air that commanded reverence and fear. He was tall, his dark hair streaked with silver at the temples, his face looking as if it were carved from ancient granite. He was a king from an older, wilder world. As King Elijah and his retinue stepped onto Stone Creek land, he paused. Alpha Stone and Lachlan, waiting at the head of their trembling pack, bowed low, their heads nearly touching the ground. But the king's attention wasn't on them. His head lifted slightly, his nostrils flaring as he scented the air. From Elspeth's hiding place, it looked like a simple assessment of the territory. But for Elijah, it was a moment of cataclysmic discovery. Beneath the common sense of pine, wolf, and fear, he caught it. Faint, elusive, but undeniable. Wildflowers crushed after a winter frost. The scent he had dreamed of for 500 years. The scent of the gentle she-wolf in the woods. His mate. She was here. His stoic exterior remained a perfect mask of control, but internally, a storm of possessive, protective rage and joyous revelation erupted. His gaze swept over the gathered pack, a king assessing his territory, but now he was not just looking, he was searching. For a fraction of a second, his piercing eyes passed over the back of the lodge, and Elspeth flinched, pulling her head back so fast she nearly hit it on the stairs. It was impossible, but she could have sworn he saw her. The sheer intensity of that brief, passing glance felt more significant than anyone had ever looked at her in her entire life. The great doors of the hall opened, and the king was led inside. The procession followed, and the doors boomed shut, leaving Elspeth alone with the scent of ozone in the air, as if a storm had just passed. She told herself it was foolish. The king wouldn't have even noticed her. And yet, she could not shake the feeling that her world, already shattered, had just tilted on its axis once more. Chapter 11. Across a crowded hall. The great hall of the Stone Creek Pack was a cavern of overwhelming sensation. The roar of two massive hearths, The boisterous shouts of warriors and the frantic, nervous energy of the pack all mingled together under the heavy, smoke-stained rafters. The air was thick with the smells of roasted meat, spilled ale, and damp wool. For Elspeth, it was a special kind of torture. She was a ghost at this feast, her sole purpose to remain invisible while keeping the goblets of her betters filled. She moved on silent feet, her head bowed, her eyes fixed on the flagstones, a practiced camouflage she had perfected over the past weeks. To be seen was to be targeted. To be invisible was to survive. At the high table, seated on a carved chair that looked more like a throne, sat King Elijah. He was an island of dangerous calm in the chaotic sea of the feast. He ate little and drank less, his piercing gaze sweeping over the hall in a slow, methodical assessment. He was not a guest celebrating. He was a predator in a den of lesser animals, and Elspeth could feel the weight of his silent judgment from across the room. He was searching for something, and a primal part of her was terrified he would find it. Her duties eventually forced her toward the high table to refill a large pitcher of wine. Her heart hammered against her ribs, her every movement stilted and clumsy. This close, his power was a physical presence, a pressure on her skin that made it hard to breathe. "Don't look up. Don't look up. Just pour the wine and leave," the mantra repeated in her head. But then she felt it, an intense, prickling sensation on the back of her neck, the exact same feeling of being watched she'd felt in the woods. Her treacherous eyes betrayed her. She lifted her head. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. Her gaze locked with the king's. The shock was so profound it felt like a physical jolt, a lightning strike that lit up every nerve in her body. She wasn't looking at a king. She was looking into the ancient, silver-luminous eyes of the shadow wolf. Recognition was instant, absolute, and terrifying. From Elijah's perspective, the connection was just as cataclysmic. His stoic, controlled facade fractured for a split second. His eyes flared with a possessive silver fire as he finally saw her up close. His mate. The gentle, sad woman from the woods, the source of the scent that haunted his dreams, was here, dressed in rags, her face smudged with soot, serving others like a common slave. A wave of silent, volcanic fury emanated from him, so potent it almost rippled the very air. The goblet in his hand creaked under the sudden pressure. The intensity of his gaze was a physical blow. A small gasp escaped Elspeth's lips, and she fumbled, the heavy ceramic pitcher slipping from her numb fingers. It clattered loudly onto the stone floor, the sound a sacrilege in the suddenly tense hall. Miraculously, it didn't break. Her face burned with shame as she scrambled to pick it up, not daring to look at him again, and fled from the high table as if the hounds of hell were at her heels. Chapter 12. A King's Scrutiny. Back in the relative anonymity of the kitchens, Elspeth leaned against a cool stone wall, her heart hammering a wild, frantic rhythm against her ribs. It was him. The wolf in the woods was the king. And he had looked at her with an intensity that promised not favor, but a terrifying, all-consuming storm. She was forced to return to the hall eventually, her fear a cold knot in her stomach. She moved with even more caution, a mouse skirting the edges of a lion's den. But something had changed. The king's stillness was no longer passive. It felt charged, menacing. And his scrutiny was now fixed on the pack's dynamics with a cold, analytical fury. Lachlan, still seething from the public embarrassment of her clumsiness before his king, saw her pass with a tray of fresh bread. His pride, already fragile, demanded a sacrifice. He wanted to reassert his dominance, to remind everyone, and perhaps the king himself, of her lowly place. As she walked by the table where he sat with his friends, he casually, almost lazily, stuck out his foot. Elspeth's worn-out sandal caught on his boot. She stumbled, a cry of surprise escaping her lips as she pitched forward. The tray flew from her hands, and the bread she had just brought from the kitchens scattered across the filthy, ale-splashed floor. A roar of laughter erupted from Lachlan's table. "Clumsy Omega!" Lachlan scoffed loudly, a cruel, triumphant sneer on his face. Can't even carry bread. Your hands are as useless as the rest of you. Clean it up. The pack watched, their faces impassive. This was normal. This was the order of things. On her hands and knees, her face burning with a shame so hot it brought tears to her eyes, Elspeth began to gather the ruined bread. But as she reached for the first piece, a profound, dangerous silence fell over the high table. The temperature in the hall seemed to drop by 10 degrees. King Elijah had not moved a muscle. He had not spoken a word, but he had slowly, deliberately, placed his heavy silver goblet on the oak table. The sound, a simple thump, echoed like a gunshot in the suddenly silent hall. His eyes, now the color of a winter storm, were fixed on Lachlan. He said nothing. He did nothing. But the sheer weight of his silent, suffocating wrath was a physical force. Lachlan's sneer faltered, then died completely. The laughter from his friends choked in their throats. The entire pack was frozen, trapped in the terrifying stillness of the king's fury. Elspeth, still on the floor, felt the shift. She saw the sweat bead on Lachlan's brow, saw the fear in his eyes as he withered under the king's silent condemnation. She didn't understand it, but she knew with absolute certainty that the king's monumental anger was not directed at her. It was a shield held over her, and a sword pointed directly at her tormentor. After an eternity, Elijah finally broke the silence, his voice a low, rumbling growl that carried to every corner of the hall. He did not address Lachlan, he addressed the Alpha. Your pack lacks discipline, Alpha Stone. The quiet words were not an observation. They were a devastating indictment, a judgment that hung in the air like a death sentence. Chapter 13. A Test of Power. The remainder of the welcome feast was a tense, miserable affair. The joyous energy was gone, replaced by a thick, cloying fear. Alpha Stone was pale, his replies to the king monosyllabic. Lachlan was seething with a silent, impotent rage, his public humiliation complete. As soon as her duties were done, Elspeth fled the hall, her mind reeling from the king's terrifying defense of her. It made no sense, and things that made no sense were dangerous. The next day, the king's quiet dismantling of the Stone Creek hierarchy continued. He was scheduled to observe the warriors' training exercises, which Lachlan, as the future Alpha, was to lead. It was Lachlan's chance to redeem himself, to showcase the strength and prowess that he believed defined him. He threw himself into the demonstration, his movements fast, powerful, and flashy, executing a complex series of attacks against a sparring partner that ended with his opponent on his back. He stood over the fallen wolf, puffing his chest out, his arrogant gaze sliding toward the king, seeking approval. The king, who had been watching from the sidelines with an expression of supreme boredom, did not offer praise. He let the silence stretch for a moment before he spoke, his voice calm but carrying easily across the training grounds. A flashy display, he said, the words a clear dismissal. But it relies on speed, not strategy. It leaves you vulnerable to a thinking opponent. Before Lachlan could retort, Elijah gestured to one of his royal guards, a silent giant of a wolf who had been standing behind him. Rorik, demonstrate. The guard moved to the center of the ring. Lachlan, his pride stung, reset himself, ready to prove the king wrong. The beta called for them to begin. Lachlan launched himself forward with the same flashy combination of moves. Rorik did not retreat. He took one step, pivoted, and used Lachlan's own momentum against him. In two swift, brutal, and breathtakingly efficient moves, a block and a takedown, he had Lachlan on his back in the dirt, the wind knocked out of him, before he could even blink. A collective gasp went through the watching warriors. They had never seen their future Alpha so effortlessly defeated. Elijah didn't gloat. He simply looked at the assembled wolves. Flash is for pups asserting dominance, he stated, his voice cold and clear as a mountain stream. True power is found in economy of motion, in control, in certainty. Remember that. The lesson was for everyone, but the humiliation was Lachlan's alone. The warriors looked from their fallen prince to the unassailable king, and a new, fearful respect dawned in their eyes. They were witnessing the vast, terrifying gap between arrogance and true authority. Elijah's cold gaze swept over them, lingered for a moment on the dirt-stained figure of Lachlan, and then drifted toward the Alpha's lodge, where he knew Elspeth was working. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his purpose here clearly far more complex than simple training evaluations. Chapter 14. The Weight of a Gaze. News of Lachlan's public humiliation on the training grounds spread through the pack like a disease. Whispers in the kitchens, furtive glances in the corridors. Elspeth heard it all. She didn't understand the king's motives. Every action he took seemed designed to systematically dismantle the authority of her alpha and the pride of the son who had rejected her. Instead of feeling vindicated, however, she only felt a deep and profound sense of dread. She was a mouse in a house where two lions were beginning to circle each other, and she was terrified she would be crushed underfoot. Her terror was magnified by a new, unnerving development. She felt the king's eyes on her constantly. His attention was a physical weight, a pressure on her skin that she could feel even when she couldn't see him. One morning, as she was weeding a small, neglected herb garden behind the kitchens, a prickling on her neck made her look up. He was there, watching from a high window in the Alpha's lodge, his figure a dark, imposing silhouette. He wasn't glaring. He was simply watching. Another time, as she carried a heavy basket of laundry across the grounds, she caught a glimpse of him standing on a stone balcony, his gaze following her slow, laborious path. She did not interpret his attention as interest or, goddess forbid, protection. Her mind, conditioned by weeks of trauma and a lifetime of feeling worthless, could only process his scrutiny through a filter of fear. He was the epitome of power and perfection. She was the pack's stain, the rejected Omega, the living symbol of disorder. She became convinced that he was watching her to find fault, to catalog her imperfections as evidence of Alpha Stone's failed leadership. Her ragged tunic, her clumsy movements, her very existence. It was all an insult to him, and he was taking note. His gaze became a source of profound, escalating anxiety. She began to actively try to avoid him, making herself even smaller, even more invisible than before. She changed her routes between the kennels and the kitchens, taking the long way around. She started her chores before dawn and finished long after dusk, hoping the shadows would hide her. But it was impossible. His presence was monolithic, pervading every corner of the pack grounds. The weight of his gaze was a constant, unnerving pressure that made her anxious and clumsy, which in turn made her even more certain of his disapproval. Late one evening, she was taking a bucket of scraps to the compost heap behind the kitchens. The air was cold, and the moon was hidden behind the clouds. She felt that familiar, intense gaze and spun around, expecting to see him at a distance, a silhouette in a window. But he was there, standing not 20 feet away at the edge of the woods, as silent and imposing as the ancient trees themselves. His hands were clasped behind his back, and he was simply watching her. He wasn't looking with anger or disgust. His expression was something else entirely. An unreadable mixture of intensity, possession, and a deep, ancient loneliness that frightened her more than any threat. She dropped the bucket with a clatter and ran. Chapter 15. A Secret Kindness. Elspeth didn't stop running until the flimsy door of her hut was shut behind her, a useless bolt drawn across it. She pressed her back against the rough wood, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The king. He had been so close. The image of his face in the near darkness was burned into her mind. That look in his eyes. It wasn't the look of a king judging a lowly subject. It was something primal, something that resonated with the broken, hollow part of her soul where her own mating bond used to be. The thought was so shocking, so impossibly dangerous, that she shoved it violently into the deepest corner of her mind and refused to look at it. She hid for the rest of the night, sleep an impossibility. The next morning, a persistent, freezing drizzle began to fall, turning the pack grounds into a sea of mud. As a clear punishment for her perceived laziness in abandoning her chore the night before, the pack's beta assigned her a miserable task, rethatching a leaky section of the kennel roof. The work was cold, wet, and agonizingly slow. Her old cloak, a thin and patched garment, was soaked through in minutes, offering no protection from the biting wind. Her fingers quickly grew numb and clumsy, and a deep, uncontrollable shiver took root in her bones. Hours into the task, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely think, she decided to risk a moment's respite. She scurried back to her hut, intending only to press her frozen hands against her skin to try and force some life back into them. But when she pushed open the door, she stopped dead in her tracks. Lying on her lumpy, straw-stuffed mattress was a cloak. It was not new, but it was of a quality she had never been privileged enough to touch. It was made of thick, dark gray wool, incredibly soft, and lined with what felt like the downy fur of a snow rabbit. It was a garment of substance, of wealth, of warmth. It smelled faintly of a clean, cold storm and ancient snow-dusted pine forests. She stood there, dripping and shivering, utterly bewildered. Who would do this? It was unthinkable. No one in the pack would give her such a gift. They would sooner watch her freeze. Her first thought was that it was a mistake, meant for someone else. But it was in her hut, on her bed. There was no one else it could be for. Hesitantly, as if it might vanish, she reached out and touched it. Then, unable to resist, she wrapped the glorious cloak around her own thin shoulders. The warmth was immediate and profound, a wave of comfort that seeped deep into her bones, quieting her shivers. As she buried her face in the soft collar, inhaling the scent clinging to the wool, ozone and ancient trees, her mind flashed back to the shadow wolf, to the sheer presence of the king. An impossible, terrifying, and deeply warming suspicion began to dawn in her mind. A sharp, authoritative knock sounded on her flimsy door, making her jump. "Elspeth!" It was the beta's harsh growl. "Lachlan wants to see you. In the Great Hall. Now." The warmth from the cloak instantly vanished, replaced by a chilling, familiar fear. The impossible kindness of one moment was about to be erased by the certain cruelty of the next. Chapter 16. A Vicious Warning. The warmth from the mysterious cloak felt like a shield, a promise of safety in a world that had offered her none. But the beta's harsh summons shattered the fragile moment. Lachlan wanted to see her. Now. The words were a death knell to the hope that had just begun to flicker within her. She couldn't possibly face him wearing this magnificent garment. It would invite questions, accusations of theft, and a punishment far worse than the cold. With a pang of deep regret, she slid the warm cloak from her shoulders, folded it carefully, and hid it beneath her thin mattress. The act felt symbolic, like she was shrugging off a suit of armor before walking into battle. The walk to the Great Hall was an ordeal. The beta stalked a few paces ahead of her, his disapproval a palpable force. Every pack member they passed stopped to stare. Their expressions were a familiar, painful mix of scorn and morbid curiosity. The rejected Omega, finally being called to answer for some new crime. She kept her head down, her focus on the muddy path, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The hall was mostly empty, the great fires banked to smoldering embers. It felt larger and colder than it had during the feast, the shadows deeper and more menacing. Lachlan stood waiting for her near the cold central hearth, his arms crossed, his handsome face twisted into an ugly sneer. He looked every bit the predator cornering his prey. He dismissed the beta with a flick of his wrist. The sound of the heavy doors booming shut behind him made Elspeth flinch. They were alone. "I see the king has taken an interest in the pack's charity cases," he began, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He took a slow, deliberate step toward her. "Tell me, Omega, what did you do to get his attention? Did you whine to him about your pathetic fate? Did you flaunt your disgrace, hoping he'd take pity on you?" Elspeth shook her head, unable to find her voice. She stood frozen, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. His eyes narrowed into angry slits. He looks at you. I've seen it. I don't know what game you are playing, but it ends now. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, his powerful body boxing her in against a stone pillar. He leaned down, his face close to hers, his scent of pine and rage overwhelming her. The king is a guest here. Guests leave. But you, Elspeth, you are here forever. This pack is your prison, and I will be its warden. He reached out and grabbed her upper arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. I want you to listen very carefully. You will not speak to him. You will not look at him. If he approaches you, you will find an excuse and you will walk away. After he is gone, your life will depend on how well you have obeyed me during his visit. Do you understand? The threat was not just a warning. It was a promise of a future more terrible than the one she was already living. A spark of defiance, fueled by the memory of a warm cloak and a pair of ancient, lonely eyes, flickered within her. For a split second, she met his furious gaze. It was a mistake. His sneer deepened. Good, he hissed, seeing the fear that replaced her defiance. Remember that fear. He released her with a violent shove that sent her stumbling backward. Now get out of my sight. Go back to whatever hole you crawled out of. She didn't need to be told twice. She turned and fled the hall, his vicious promise echoing in her ears, trapping her between a king she didn't understand and a monster she understood all too well. Chapter 17. The Eve of Fealty. From the window of the chambers he had been given, Alpha King Elijah watched the last vestiges of daylight bleed from the sky over the Stone Creek territory. The room was luxurious by the pack's standards. Thick furs on the bed, a fire roaring in the hearth. But it felt like a cage. He had not rested since his arrival. For the first time in over a century, sleep felt like a waste of precious time. He was an immortal, a creature of epochs and ages, but he had never felt such a profound sense of urgency. For 500 years, he had walked the earth as an incomplete being. He had built kingdoms, commanded armies, and watched generations of his people live and die, all while a part of his own soul remained dormant, waiting. He had endured centuries of empty feasts, hollow victories, and the crushing, silent loneliness of a throne without its queen. Over time, the hope of ever finding his fated mate had weathered into a dull, persistent ache, a ghost pain for a limb he'd never had. He had resigned himself to his fate, to ruling alone until the end of his days, a king in title, but not in spirit. Then, he had scented it. That impossible fragrance of wildflowers and winter frost, a scent he had only ever known in the deepest, most sacred part of his wolf's dreams. He had followed it into the woods and found her, a she-wolf with sadness in her eyes and a gentleness in her touch that healed more than just a fawn's broken leg. And then he had seen her here, in this den of arrogant fools, a jewel covered in the mud of their contempt. The dormant bond within him had not stirred. It had erupted, a volcanic possessive force that demanded he act, that he claim, that he protect. His fists clenched at his side as he thought of the boy Lachlan. The sheer, staggering arrogance of the child was an insult to the goddess herself. To be gifted with the other half of one's soul and to discard it for something as fleeting as status, it was a sacrilege. Elijah had seen the ghost of the snapped bond that haunted Elspeth's aura, had felt the echo of her pain as if it were his own. His wolf, a primal beast kept on a tight leash for centuries, snarled within him, demanding retribution, demanding he tear the boy apart for the crime he had committed against their mate. But Elijah's rage was colder, more patient. The boy's death would be too quick a mercy. Humiliation, the stripping of all he held dear, was a far more fitting punishment. He knew what he had to do. Tomorrow, during the fealty ceremony, in front of the entire pack that had stood by and watched her suffer, he would rewrite their reality. He would not just shelter her from the storm, he would become the storm itself, and he would wash this pack clean of its filth. He would shatter their pathetic hierarchy, and raise her up to her rightful place at his side. He looked out the window, his gaze finding the distant tiny hut she called home. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a promise to the coming dawn, to the moon, and to the soul that was calling to his. Tomorrow, he vowed, his eyes glowing with silver light in the darkness of the room. Tomorrow, everything changes. Chapter 18. The Formal Hall. The morning of the fealty ceremony dawned gray and oppressive, the sky weeping a slow, miserable drizzle that mirrored the dread in Elspeth's heart. She was roused before sunrise and ordered to the great hall, not to serve, but to attend. The command was a special kind of cruelty. They wanted her there to witness Lachlan's triumph, to stand among the pack as he pledged himself to the king and solidified his place as their future leader. She was to be a living testament to his power, the thing he had been strong enough to cast aside. Clad in her most drab, threadbare tunic, she felt a desperate urge to wrap herself in the warm, dark cloak hidden beneath her bed, to carry its secret strength with her. But she resisted. The cloak was a mystery, a dangerous secret in a place where any deviation from her miserable norm was cause for punishment. Instead, she found a spot at the very back of the hall, behind a thick stone pillar that offered at least the illusion of obscurity. She hoped the deep shadows would swallow her whole. The hall had been transformed. The long feast tables were gone, replaced by rows of benches arranged by rank. Heavy banners bearing the king's crest, a snarling wolf's head crowned with silver, were hung from the rafters, covering the faded Stone Creek emblems. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax from hundreds of lit candles and the heavy, anxious silence of the assembled pack. Everyone was in their finest formal leathers, their faces scrubbed, their expressions a mixture of awe and raw fear. Then, the great doors swung open. King Elijah entered. He was flanked by 10 of his royal guards, their presence a silent, lethal promise. The king himself was dressed not in opulent finery, but in simple, perfectly tailored black leather that emphasized the sheer power of his physique. He wore no crown, but he needed none. Authority rolled off him in palpable waves, a force that demanded obedience. He walked with a slow, deliberate grace to the large, throne-like chair that had been placed for him on a raised dais, and took his seat. The entire hall knelt as one. "Rise," his voice commanded, the sound low but carrying to every corner. The pack rose. Elspeth kept her head bowed, her eyes fixed on the dirty straw covering the floor. But she felt it. She felt his gaze sweep the hall, a methodical inspection that missed nothing. She flinched when his attention passed over her section, her muscles tensing for a blow that never came. His gaze continued on, cool and assessing, moving on to the warriors at the front. And yet, she felt an undeniable connection, a subtle, invisible tether of awareness pulling from him to her. He had not paused, had given no sign, but she knew with a terrifying, heart-stopping certainty that he knew exactly where she was. Alpha Stone stepped forward, striking a ceremonial staff carved from ancient oak on the stone floor. The sound boomed through the silent hall, a final, fateful call to order. Let the tithe of fealty commence. Chapter 19. Pledges of Power. The ceremony began, unfolding with a solemn, rigid formality that had been practiced for generations. The pack's lead warrior, a grizzled veteran named Ulrich with a scar that split his left eyebrow, was the first to approach. He walked to the center of the hall, his footsteps echoing in the silence, and knelt before the dais where King Elijah sat. Placing a clenched fist over his heart, he recited the ancient oath, his voice rough but clear. "I, Ulrich of Stone Creek, pledge my fang and my claw, my heart and my life to you, my Alpha King. My loyalty is yours until my final breath." King Elijah watched him, his face impassive. When the oath was complete, he gave a single sharp nod of acceptance. Ulrich bowed his head, then rose and returned to his place. The ritual was complete. The next warrior stepped forward. One by one they came. The ceremony was a slow, deliberate display of the pack's strength and submission. Each warrior, from the oldest veterans to the young, nervous fighters who had only recently come of age, made the same walk, took the same knee, and spoke the same sacred words. With each pledge, the tension in the hall coiled tighter, a spring being wound to its breaking point. Elijah received each oath with the same regal stillness, his expression betraying nothing. He was a mountain, observing the flow of a small river at its base, patient, ancient, and unshakable. He seemed to be merely observing a tedious but necessary ritual, and this very stillness made the atmosphere crackle with unspoken anticipation. From her hiding place at the back, Elspeth watched through the gaps between the wolves standing in front of her. Her heart was a leaden weight in her chest. Each pledge felt like the tick of a clock, counting down to a moment she desperately wished she could avoid. She risked a glance at Lachlan, who stood beside his father near the front. He looked proud, his posture radiating confidence, his face set in a look of noble impatience. He was ready for his moment in the spotlight, ready to impress the king and cement his future. He caught one of the high-born she-wolves looking at him and gave her a subtle, arrogant smirk. The last of the ranked warriors finally made his pledge and returned to his place. A profound silence fell over the hall. The beta, who had been calling the names, stepped back, his role concluded. There was a pause, a collective intake of breath from the entire pack. It was the Alpha family's turn. Alpha Stone, his face grim, placed a hand on his son's shoulder and gave a firm nod. With a confident stride that bordered on a swagger, Lachlan stepped forward into the open space before the king's throne. The attention of every wolf in the hall, and the silent, heavy gaze of the king, was fixed entirely on him. This was the moment he had been waiting for, his chance to finally claim the respect he felt he was owed. He knelt, bowing his head in a perfect gesture of fealty. Chapter 20. The Boast of a Fool. Kneeling on the cold stone floor, Lachlan felt a surge of triumph. The earlier humiliations, the tripping incident, the disgrace on the training field, were nothing more than minor setbacks. This, the formal fealty ceremony, was the true test of a future alpha, and he was certain he would pass it with ease. He could feel the eyes of the entire pack on his back, a mixture of respect and envy. Before him sat the king, the ultimate symbol of power, the one man whose approval truly mattered. Lachlan did not just see a king. He saw a reflection of his own future self. He did not begin with the simple oath. That was for common warriors. He, the Alpha's heir, deserved a preamble. He lifted his head, his voice ringing with a confidence he had practiced for days. "My king," he began, his tone formal and self-important. "Before I pledge my arm, I must first pledge my spirit. The spirit of the Silver Moon bloodline, an unbroken line of alphas who have guarded this territory for generations. We have kept the old ways, the traditions of strength and honor that make our kind great." He paused for dramatic effect, letting his words sink in. "Under my father's leadership, and one day my own, Stone Creek has purged its weaknesses. We have upheld the sacred honor of the bloodline, ensuring that only the strongest contribute to the future of our pack. We bow to the wisdom of the goddess, but we are not slaves to her whims. We forge our own destiny." The irony of his words was lost on him, a fool boasting of his clear vision to the one man who could truly see. From the back of the hall, Elspeth listened to his speech, and a cold wave of resignation washed over her. Purged its weaknesses. He was talking about her. His words were a public reinforcement of her rejection, a final twist of the knife. She shrank further into the shadows of the pillar, wishing she could simply dissolve into nothing. Throughout the pompous speech, Elijah remained utterly still. His face was an impassive mask of granite, his ancient eyes betraying nothing of the cold, contemptuous fury building within him. He simply watched, a predator allowing its prey to wander deeper into the trap, letting Lachlan weave a noose of his own arrogant words. Finally, Lachlan reached his conclusion, his voice swelling with pride. "And so, it is with this spirit of strength and a pure heart that I, Lachlan, future Alpha of Stone Creek, make my vow." He placed his fist over his heart. I pledge my unwavering strength to you, my king, for the honor of my pack and the strength of my line." He bowed his head low, a perfect picture of fealty, waiting for the king's nod of acceptance, the final seal on his triumphant performance. The nod did not come. The silence in the hall stretched for 1 second, then 2. It became heavy, suffocating. And then a new sound emerged, quiet at first, then growing in volume. It was a low, dangerous sound that seemed to emanate not from the king's throat, but from the very throne itself. A deep, possessive growl that vibrated through the stones of the floor and up the bones of every wolf in the hall. Chapter 21. Mine. The growl was a force of nature. It was not the sound of a mere wolf. It was the sound of the earth splitting open, of an ancient power unchained. It vibrated through the stone floor, up the bones of every wolf in the hall, and settled deep in their marrow. Every instinct screamed at them to submit. Lachlan, still kneeling, finally looked up from his performance, his face a mask of confusion and dawning terror. The king's face was no longer impassive. It was a terrifying visage of cold, absolute fury, and it was not directed at him. The king wasn't even looking at him. His burning silver gaze was fixed on the back of the hall, on the shadows, on her. Then Elijah rose from his throne. The movement was not hurried. It was deliberate, unstoppable, the ascent of a mountain peak from the ocean floor. He completely ignored Lachlan, who was still kneeling before the empty throne like a discarded toy. The insult was so profound, so complete, that a collective gasp went through the hall. The king began to walk. He moved with a predator's grace, a king striding toward his destiny, and the pack parted before him like a river around a great stone. Warriors who had never backed down from a fight scrambled to get out of his path, their heads bowed low. The entire focus of the room, every terrified gaze, followed his inexorable path toward the back of the hall. Elspeth, hidden behind her pillar, felt a terrifying pull, a sense of grim inevitability. Her heart hammered against her ribs. He was coming for her. There was nowhere left to run. He stopped directly in front of her, plunging her into his immense shadow. The entire pack turned as one to stare. In an instant, she was ripped from her comforting invisibility and thrust into the center of their universe. He was even more imposing up close, a titan of raw power and ancient authority. But as he looked down at her, she saw no anger in his eyes. She saw a fierce, possessive reverence that stole the breath from her lungs. He slowly lifted a hand, and every wolf in the hall flinched as if he were about to strike her. Instead, he gently, tenderly cupped her cheek. His touch was not cold, but electric, a jolt of pure energy and impossible warmth that chased away the chill in her bones. His voice, when he spoke, was a low rumble of thunder and reverence, yet it carried to every corner of the silent hall. "For centuries, I have walked this earth alone. I believed my other half was lost to time. I was wrong." He turned his head just slightly, his burning gaze finding and pinning a horrified Lachlan to the floor. "You," he growled, the word dripping with contempt. "You told her she was unworthy. You, a boy playing at being a man, dared to discard a gift from the goddess herself." He turned back to Elspeth, his gaze softening with a love so profound it made her knees weak. "He was wrong," he said, his voice for her and for all of them. "You are not just worthy. You are everything. You are the other half of my soul." His voice dropped to a possessive primal whisper that sealed her fate. "You are mine." And in front of her former tormentors, in front of the man who had shattered her, the Alpha King leaned down. His fangs, white and sharp, extended, and he sank them into the juncture of her neck and shoulder. It was not a bite of pain, but a mark of pure, searing ecstasy. A shockwave of power, of love, of destiny fulfilled, slammed into her. The bond, a cataclysm of light and sensation, roared to life. Chapter 22. The Shattering of Pride. The bond was not a thread, it was a tidal wave. It crashed into Elspeth, flooding the cold, empty void in her chest with a brilliant, golden warmth. It was pure power, raw and untamed. It was pure love, ancient and absolute. She felt his centuries of loneliness, his unshakable resolve, and the depth of his devotion for her, all in a single, breathtaking instant. She felt his strength as if it were her own, a bedrock of certainty that obliterated the last lingering shadows of her own self-doubt. She gasped, her hand flying to her neck where his mark now blazed like a star, a permanent claim on her soul. A wave of palpable energy rolled off them and washed over the great hall. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The pack collapsed. It was not a gesture of respect. It was an act of complete and utter submission, a primal instinct to prostrate themselves before a power so far beyond their own. Every wolf, from Alpha Stone to the lowest Omega, was on the floor, their faces pressed to the cold stone, trembling. All except one. Lachlan was still on the floor where he had knelt, but he was no longer a proud prince. He was a broken thing, his body slumped, his head hanging. He stared at Elspeth, his face a canvas of disbelief, rage, and soul-shattering humiliation. In his eyes, she was no longer the worthless Omega he had cast aside, but a radiant, terrifying queen who held his entire world in the palm of her hand. His boastful speech, his life's ambition, his very identity, it had all turned to ash in a single, world-altering moment. A strangled, choking sound escaped his throat. Elijah straightened to his full height, his arm wrapping possessively around Elspeth's waist, pulling her protectively against his side. He surveyed the scene, his gaze one of cold, righteous fury. He looked down at the two wolves who had caused his mate such pain. "Alpha Stone," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. The Alpha flinched on the floor but did not dare to rise. "You stood by while a gift from the goddess was scorned in your hall. You allowed your bloodline's arrogance to poison your pack. You have failed in your sacred duty." He let the judgment hang in the air. "As of this moment, you are Alpha no longer. This pack is under my direct authority until I deem it worthy of a leader. Your son's claim as heir is nullified. He is nothing." The words were spoken not with a roar, but with the chilling finality of a death sentence. Lachlan's last shred of hope died. His father, his life's work undone, let out a wretched sob. Two of the king's royal guards moved forward, their expressions like stone, to stand over the disgraced father and son. Elijah looked down at Elspeth, his stormy eyes softening only for her. "No one," he vowed, his voice a sacred oath, "will ever harm you again." Chapter 23. The Voice of a Queen. The promise was a balm on a wound she hadn't realized was still bleeding. Elspeth leaned into Elijah's strength, the river of the bond a current of courage inside her. The fear that had been her constant companion for weeks had vanished, burned away by the radiant heat of his love and her own reclaimed worth. She was no longer a ghost. She was a fire. From the floor, Lachlan, in his final desperate throes of denial, looked at her, his voice a ragged, hateful whisper. You manipulated him. A worthless Omega. You tricked him." Elijah's body went rigid, a low, murderous growl rumbling in his chest. He took a step forward, ready to strike the boy down for his final insult. But Elspeth placed a hand on his arm. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Let me." He looked down at her, surprised, but saw the new unshakable strength in her eyes. He gave a single, proud nod and stepped back, ceding the floor to his queen. This was her moment, her justice to claim. All eyes, filled with awe and terror, turned to Elspeth. She took a step forward, away from the protection of her mate, and stood on her own. She looked down at the broken man who had been the architect of her misery. When she spoke, her voice did not tremble. It was not loud, but it was clear and steady, ringing with an authority that shocked everyone, including herself. "You called me weak, Lachlan," she began, her tone calm and measured. "But strength is not the power to hurt. It is the power to endure. You tried to break me, and I endured. She took another step. You called me nothing, but a person's worth is not a title to be given or taken away. It is a fire within. Mine was always there. You were just too blinded by your own ambition to see it. Her gaze was unwavering, her words a final, devastating judgment. And you called me unworthy, she finished, her voice softening with a sad, profound pity. But my worth was never yours to judge. You looked at a gift from the goddess and saw only a reflection of your own shallow pride. That is your failing, Lachlan, and it will be your undoing, not mine. The words hung in the silent hall, more powerful than any physical blow. She had not screamed or raged. She had confronted him with a quiet, unshakable dignity that cemented her new status more than any crown could have. Lachlan had no response. He simply stared, completely and utterly defeated, broken not by the king's power, but by the quiet truth spoken by the woman he had thrown away. Elspeth held his gaze for a moment longer before turning her back on him, a final, complete act of dismissal. She walked back to Elijah, her true mate, who looked at her with boundless pride and a love that lit up his ancient eyes. "It is time to go home, my queen," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he had waited centuries to feel. The word home hung in the air, a promise of a future she had never, ever dared to dream of. Chapter 24, A New Dawn. Their departure from the Great Hall was a silent, solemn procession. The entire Stone Creek pack remained prostrate on the floor, a sea of bowed heads and submitted spirits. Elspeth walked with her head held high, Elijah's strong, warm hand in hers, a silent, unshakable anchor. Flanked by the royal guard, they passed through the great doors and out into the open air without a single backward glance. As she crossed the threshold, Elspeth took a deep breath. She was not just leaving the hall. She was leaving behind a lifetime of pain, of loneliness, of feeling like a ghost in her own skin. She was walking away from the ashes of her old life and into the brilliant, unknown light of a new one. As if on cue, the miserable drizzle that had plagued the morning finally ceased. A sliver of sunlight broke through the heavy gray clouds, casting long, hopeful rays across the muddy pack grounds. The air smelled clean, washed new. Their journey began in a comfortable silence, moving away from the territory that had been her prison. With every step, Elspeth felt the suffocating weight of her past growing lighter and lighter, until it was nothing more than a distant memory. Once they were clear of the Stone Creek borders, in the quiet tranquility of the ancient forest that belonged to no pack but the king himself, Elijah finally stopped and turned to her. He took both of her hands in his. "I am sorry for the life you have endured," he said, his voice raw with an emotion that humbled her. "No one should have suffered as you have." "It led me to you," she replied softly, her own voice filled with a wonder that was still so new. "So I cannot regret it." A slow, breathtaking smile spread across his face, a true smile that erased the centuries of weariness from his eyes. "For 500 years, he said, his gaze intense, "I have been a king of territories and power, but my soul has been a kingdom of one. I was a leader, but I was not whole. Your kindness, which you showed to a helpless creature when you believed no one was watching, that is a queen's strength. Your resilience in the face of their cruelty, that is a ruler's heart." He squeezed her hands gently. "They cast you down for being gentle, but it is that gentleness this world needs most. Rule with me, Elspeth, not behind me but beside me. Be the heart to my sword, the dawn to my dusk." Tears welled in her eyes, not of sadness, but of a joy so profound it was overwhelming. This mighty ancient king was not just claiming her, he was seeing her, valuing the very parts of her that others had scorned. "Yes," she whispered, the single word holding a lifetime of hope. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture of pure, reverent devotion. He kept her hand in his as they turned and continued their journey, walking side by side toward the horizon, toward his kingdom, toward their home. The sun was now fully free of the clouds, bathing the path before them in a warm, golden light. Her past was a land of shadows, but her future, she knew with every fiber of her being, was a new dawn.